Lindiwe froze in the rain as the metal gate of her own mansion slammed shut in front of her. Her hands trembled beneath torn gloves. Water dripped from the edge of her dirty headscarf. A moment earlier, Ayanda had looked straight into her eyes, then turned away in disgust, as if the old beggar at the gate was less than human. But Lindiwe was no beggar. She was the woman who had built that house, fed everyone inside it, and trusted them with her heart. Hidden beneath the wrinkles, dust, and silence was a mother about to witness the truth. And before dawn she would discover that the cruelest betrayal in her family was not the one she came to find. Before we go further, tell me this: do you believe people reveal their true character only when they think no one important is watching? And where are you watching from today, and what time is it in your country right now? If stories about truth, family, and justice move you, subscribe and stay with us until the end. Lindiwe remained still long after the gate had closed. Rainwater slid down the iron bars and soaked the sleeves of her faded cardigan. Behind the wall rose the warm yellow lights of the mansion she had built brick by brick, contract by contract, sacrifice by sacrifice. From the outside, the home still looked like everything she had dreamed of years ago, a place of safety, legacy, and family. But standing there in the dark, bent beneath the weight of old clothes and a false age, she felt like a stranger staring at someone else's life. The security guard shifted awkwardly near the gatehouse. He had not shoved her. He had not cursed her. But he had obeyed. That, too, said something. Lindiwe lowered her head and shuffled toward the side of the property, moving slowly enough to keep up the disguise, but her mind was racing. She had expected discomfort, perhaps cold politeness, perhaps a dismissive glance, but she had not expected Ayanda's eyes. Those eyes had not merely rejected a beggar. They had measured her, then discarded her. At the front entrance moments earlier, Ayanda had stood under the awning in a cream sweater dress, holding a mug of imported tea, her phone in one manicured hand. Her face had first tightened with irritation, then sharpened with something crueler. Why do these people always come to rich homes? Ayanda had muttered, not quietly enough. Lindiwe had kept her shoulders hunched and her voice weak. "Please, my daughter, only a little water." Ayanda did not answer her directly. She turned to the guard instead. "Get her away from here, now, before the neighbors see this." The words still rang in Lindiwe's ears. Before the neighbors see this. Not she looks sick, not she needs help, not even give her something and let her go. Only shame, image, appearance. Lindiwe had built companies large enough to survive market crashes. She had negotiated with ministers' rivals and foreign investors. She knew how to read lies hidden behind perfect smiles. But it was one thing to suspect vanity in a daughter-in-law. It was another to hear contempt spill out so naturally. She moved along the outer wall until she reached a cluster of jacaranda trees near the service road. There, half hidden in the shadows, she could see the side terrace and part of the front garden. Ayanda was still standing beneath the awning, now joined by one of the younger housemaids, a slim girl named Zinzi, who had worked there for less than a year. Ayanda handed her the empty mug without looking at her. "Make another one. Less sugar this time." "Yes," Madame Zinzi said softly. Ayanda's gaze drifted toward the gate again. "And tell the guards not to let these street people anywhere near this house." Zinzi hesitated. "She looked very tired, madame." Ayanda turned so sharply that the girl nearly flinched. "That is not my problem." There was a small silence, the kind that filled rooms when power wanted to be noticed. Then Ayanda gave a dry laugh and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. If Mother were here, she would probably start another lecture about compassion. Her tone was mocking now. But let's be honest, when old people get too sentimental, they stop seeing clearly. Lindiwe's fingers tightened around the torn edge of her shawl. Zinzi looked down. "Madame Lindiwe has a good heart." Ayanda smiled, but there was no warmth in it. A good heart is useful when you're poor. When you're rich, it becomes a weakness. The sentence struck Lindiwe harder than the rain. For years, Ayanda had spoken with careful respect at family lunches. She had called her mother in a voice dipped in honey. She had praised the family's values in public, accompanied Lindiwe to church charity drives, smiled for photographs beside orphaned children, and posted captions about gratitude and grace. And now, in the space of minutes, another woman had appeared. A woman who spoke of kindness as if it were a disease. Ayanda stepped closer to Zinzi and lowered her voice. But the wet night carried sound clearly. Anyway, none of this will matter much longer. Zinzi blinked. Madame Ayanda folded her arms. Mother cannot run everything forever. She is tired, old, stubborn. One day this house, that company, all of it will have to pass to the next generation. She said, pass the way some people said belong. Lindiwe felt her throat tighten. Zinzi gave a nervous smile, unsure whether she was meant to answer. Ayanda continued more boldly now that no one important seemed to be listening. And when it does, some of us will finally stop pretending. Those words landed like a stone thrown through glass. Lindiwe had come to test behavior. What she was hearing was ambition without shame. She watched Ayanda check her phone, roll her eyes at a message, then call out toward the open front door. Saifo, are you coming or not? A moment later, Saifo appeared in the foyer. Jacket loosened tie, half pulled down. Her eldest son looked tired, distracted already, carrying the permanent frown of a man who believed the world had delayed what was rightfully his. Lindiwe's heart softened at the sight of him out of instinct, but only for a moment. Ayanda did not know he was still far enough away for only fragments to carry. She walked toward him, irritated. That woman was still at the gate. Sifo glanced past her, barely interested. Which woman? The beggar. So the guards handled it. Ayanda lowered her voice again, but the wind betrayed her. This is exactly what I mean. The house feels exposed lately, disorganized. Your mother lets too many people become comfortable around her. Staff charity cases, old employees, pastors, widows, children from everywhere. There are no boundaries. Saifo rubbed his temple. Not tonight, Ayanda. But she pressed on. I'm serious, Saifo. The way she runs things may have worked 10 years ago. Not now. The company needs structure. The family needs order. Lindiwe's pulse slowed into something colder than anger. Not grief yet. Recognition. Ayanda was not simply cruel. She was strategic. Every complaint was polished. Every insult wore the suit of reason. She was not attacking compassion because she hated weakness alone. She was attacking the values that stood between her and control. Saifo said something too low to catch. Ayanda stepped nearer, her voice sharpened with impatience. You keep waiting, waiting for the right time, waiting for her to trust you more, waiting for her to step aside on her own. But tell me, when has Lindiwe ever stepped aside for anyone? There it was. Not mother now. Lindiwe. The maid looked frozen. Even from the darkness, Lindiwe could see fear in the girl's posture. In some households, servants heard too much and survived by remembering nothing. Saifo glanced toward the driveway. Lower your voice. Ayanda laughed once, bitterly. For what, everyone already knows what's coming. She's getting older. Sometime soon there'll be decisions to make. Shares. Authority, property. She lifted one shoulder. And when that happens, I refuse to stand by while people like Thandaka benefit from work they never did. At the mention of Thandaka, Lindiwe's attention sharpened further. Her younger daughter-in-law rarely argued with anyone. She moved quietly through the house, offered help before being asked, and rarely entered the invisible competitions. Ayanda seemed to breathe like air. Lindiwe had sometimes mistaken that silence for passivity. Now she wondered if it had another cause. Sifo exhaled. Don't start this again. Ayanda's voice dropped into something smooth and poisonous. I am not starting anything. I'm being realistic. Your mother loves appearances. She likes humble people, soft people, especially Thandaka with that quiet face and those careful little acts of goodness. Ayanda leaned closer. But goodness does not build empires. Power does. Lindiwe closed her eyes. The sentence tore open a memory of her late husband telling her many years before, "Watch the people who admire sacrifice only when they profit from it." When she opened her eyes again, Ayanda was already turning away. And one more thing she said over her shoulder to Saifo. "If Mother disappears for even a week, this family will show its real shape." Saifo said nothing. That silence frightened Lindiwe more than if he had agreed aloud. A car door slammed somewhere farther down the drive. Music floated faintly from a phone. A dog barked from a neighboring property. Life went on indifferent to revelation. But for Lindiwe, something irreversible had happened. She had not just seen Ayanda reject a poor stranger. She had seen the mask slip, and behind it was not mere vanity, not a temper, not a bad day. It was hunger. Hunger for rank, for inheritance, for the right to decide who was worthy and who could be thrown outside the gate. Lindiwe drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped back into deeper shadow. Her chest ached not from the cold, but from the terrible clarity settling inside her. This was only the first gate, and it had already opened onto the truth. Behind her in the darkness beyond the mansion walls, thunder rolled across the city. Lindiwe lifted her tired eyes toward the lit windows of the home she no longer recognized. Then, with a broken mother's silence and a strategist's patience, she made her way toward the back of the property. If the front of the house had shown her pride, perhaps the kitchen would reveal the heart. The back of the estate felt like another world. At the front, everything was polished stone, imported lanterns, trimmed hedges, and the glowing performance of wealth. But behind the mansion, past the laundry path and the line of rain barrels, life returned to simpler rhythms. Steam drifted from the kitchen vents. The scent of onions, pepper, and broth floated into the wet air. Somewhere nearby, dishes clinked. A radio murmured low beneath the sound of drizzle tapping against corrugated roofing. Lindiwe slowed her steps. This part of the house had once been her favorite, not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest. No guests posed here. No one arranged their smile for photographs. This was where food was made, where workers laughed when the family was asleep, where real exhaustion had no time to pretend. Now wrapped in torn layers and carrying the stoop of an old beggar, she moved toward the faint rectangle of yellow light spilling from the back kitchen door. Her heart was harder than it had been an hour ago. Ayanda's words still lived inside her like a wound. But as Lindiwe reached the steps, another voice drifted out. Soft, female, young but tired in a way only life could teach. "Put that tray there, please. I'll finish the rest." Lindiwe recognized it at once. Thandaka, the younger daughter-in-law. Lindiwe stayed just outside the doorway, half in darkness, watching. Thandaka stood near the stove, in a plain sweater and long skirt, with no jewelry except her wedding band. Her hair was tied back carelessly, not for style, but for convenience. A pot simmered before her. She was stirring it slowly with one hand, while folding small dishcloths with the other. There was no audience, no husband nearby, no mother-in-law to impress. Only work. Only care. Zinzi the maid from the front entrance entered with a metal tray and looked surprised to see Thandaka still there. "Madam, I thought you went upstairs already." Thandaka shook her head. "Not yet. Baba Dlamini's cough sounded worse tonight. I wanted to send him something warm." Baba Dlamini was the elderly groundskeeper who had served the family since before Saifo was married. Lindiwe's chest tightened at the casual kindness in that sentence. Thandaka had not said it proudly. She had said it the way one might say, The rain had started simply because it was true. Zinzi set the tray down. "You always do too much." Thandeka gave a faint smile. "Or perhaps the rest of us do too little." It was a quiet line, almost playful, but pain moved beneath it. Lindiwe saw it. Before she could think better of it, she stepped into the edge of the light and let out a weak cough. The sound startled both women. Zinzi turned, first eyes widening. The beggar woman, Thandeka, spun around. Her expression changed instantly, not to disgust, not to alarm, but to concern. "Oh no," she said, setting down the spoon. "You're soaked." Lindiwe lowered her head and let her voice shake. "I'm sorry, my daughter. I only wanted somewhere dry for a moment. I will leave soon." Thandeka crossed the room before Zinzi could say another word. "No. Sit first." There was no hesitation. No performance. She guided Lindiwe toward a wooden chair near the side table. Her hands were gentle, steady, and warm. Lindiwe sat slowly, feeling the ache in her knees become suddenly real, even though the disguise was false. There was something about being helped with tenderness that made the body remember every burden it had ever carried. Zinzi looked toward the door nervously. Madame Ayanda said no one from outside should be near the house. Thandeka did not even turn. "Then don't tell Madame Ayanda." The answer was simple. Calm. A strange emotion rose in Lindiwe's throat. Thandeka knelt to look at her face properly. "Have you eaten?" A little, Lindiwe whispered. "That means no." Without waiting for permission, Thandeka moved back to the stove, poured hot soup into a bowl, tore a piece of fresh bread and placed both before her. Then she took a clean towel from a shelf and offered it carefully. "Dry your face first. Slowly. You're shivering." Lindiwe accepted the towel with trembling fingers. It was clean, soft. It smelled faintly of soap and sun. For a moment she could not speak. She had come to test hearts, but she had not prepared herself for how starving her own heart was for kindness. "Thank you," she murmured. Thandeka only nodded. "Eat before it gets cold." Lindiwe lifted the spoon. The soup was simple pumpkin ginger, a little pepper, but it carried the warmth of being made for someone, not just cooked. She swallowed once, then again, each mouthful settling into her like mercy. Zinzi lingered uneasily. "If anyone sees, then let them see," Thandeka said, though the firmness in her voice carried strain. "I will answer for it." That made Lindiwe look up. There it was again. Not fear exactly, not weakness. Something closer to practiced caution. The posture of a woman who had learned that doing the right thing often came with a price. Zinzi lowered her voice. "You know how they speak." Thandeka looked back at the simmering pot. "Yes, I know." The room fell quiet for a few seconds. Rain tapped softly against the rear window. A fridge hummed. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a servant laughed at something quickly muffled. Lindiwe kept eating slowly enough to remain believable, but her mind was alert. She studied Thandeka the way she used to study contract clauses, searching not for what was shown, but for what was carefully hidden. The younger woman's face was composed, but there was fatigue beneath her eyes. Not the fatigue of laziness, the fatigue of private endurance. When Zinzi finally left with the tray, the kitchen became still. Only Thandeka and the beggar remained. Thandeka poured warm water into a cup and set it down beside the soup. "You should stay here until the rain softens." Lindiwe looked up through the lines of her disguise. "Why help me?" The question came out more raw than she intended. Thandeka paused. For the first time, a guarded look passed across her face. Not because she regretted helping, but because the question had touched something old inside her. Then she answered quietly, "Because one day I may need someone to help my mother too." Lindiwe's breath caught. Thandeka lowered her eyes as if the words had slipped out before she could stop them. She lives in KwaZulu-Natal, far from here. I don't get to see her enough. She forced a small smile. Every time I see an older woman alone, I think, perhaps somewhere someone is ignoring my own mother the same way. Lindiwe said nothing. She could not. Compassion born from imagination was one thing. Compassion born from personal ache was another. That kind usually ran deeper. Thandeka turned to wipe the counter, but Lindiwe noticed her glance toward the clock, then toward the back door, then toward a small handbag hanging on a hook near the pantry. A flicker of tension, a tiny crack in the calm. Lindiwe stored it away. "You are troubled," she said softly. Thandeka's shoulders stiffened. "No. It came too quickly." Lindiwe lowered her spoon. "Forgive me. Old people notice things." A sad smile touched Thandeka's mouth. "Yes," she said. "You do." For a moment she seemed about to leave it there. Then, perhaps because the stranger before her appeared harmless, perhaps because loneliness sometimes needed any witness it could find, she spoke again. "Sometimes being quiet makes people think you have no heart, or no mind. They think silence means emptiness." She folded the towel that Lindiwe had used, smoothing it with care. But sometimes silence is just how people survive. The sentence hung in the kitchen like steam. Lindiwe felt it settle deep. She had misunderstood that silence too, perhaps. All these months she had seen Thandeka withdraw from Ayanda's sharp remarks, from Saifo's dismissive jokes, from the endless invisible rankings of the house. Lindiwe had taken it for softness, for lack of ambition, for mildness without depth. Now she wondered how much of it had been restraint, how much had been protection. Her gaze drifted toward the handbag again. As if sensing it, Thandeka moved subtly to block it from view. Another detail, another hidden thing. Later, after a long enough pause, someone's footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy, male, approaching. Thandeka's face changed at once. Not guilt, alarm. She moved quickly toward Lindiwe and lowered her voice. "Please don't speak unless you must." A second later, the kitchen door swung open. Themba stood there. He looked tired from work jacket, damp at the shoulders, phone still in hand. He stopped when he saw the old woman at the table. His eyes moved from Lindiwe to Thandeka, then to the soup bowl, the towel, the chair drawn close to the stove. "What is this?" he asked. Thandeka straightened. She was outside in the rain. Themba frowned. "Ayanda said no strangers near the house." "She is not dangerous," Thandeka replied. "She is cold." Themba exhaled sharply, already anticipating conflict. "If Ayanda finds out, she'll make it a whole drama." Something hardened in Lindiwe at the ease of that response. Not cruelty, cowardice. Thandeka seemed to feel it too. Her voice remained respectful, but a quiet sadness entered it. "So we should send her back into the rain to keep peace." Themba looked away. He had no answer. After a tense second, he muttered, "Just be careful," and left the room. The door closed behind him. Silence returned. But now Lindiwe understood something new. Thandeka was not merely kind. She was kind in a house where kindness had become dangerous. That changed everything. Still, the handbag on the hook remained. The clock kept moving. The hidden tension had not vanished. As Lindiwe finished the last of the soup, she saw Thandeka glance once more toward the back door, this time with unmistakable worry. There was something else, something private, something she was protecting as fiercely as she had protected a stranger from the rain. And for the first time that night, Lindiwe felt not just warmth toward her younger daughter-in-law, but curiosity. The front gate had revealed pride. The back kitchen had revealed compassion. Now the question was whether compassion itself was hiding a secret. By the time the rain softened into a thin silver mist, the mansion had become quieter on the outside and louder within. Lindiwe left the back kitchen with slow, unsteady steps, still wearing the body of a beggar and the silence of a mother gathering evidence against her own blood. Thandeka had tried to persuade her to stay longer under the stove's warmth, but Lindiwe insisted on leaving, afraid that too much kindness might make her forget why she had come. She moved along the side wall again, past trimmed hedges darkened by rain and the stone pathway leading toward the main terrace. The house shimmered with wealth. Glass doors reflected golden light. Sculpted plants stood motionless in decorative planters. Water rolled off the roof in steady ribbons. From a distance it still looked like a home that held dignity and order. But Lindiwe had spent enough years in boardrooms to know that polished surfaces often hid the first cracks. She reached the broad window that looked into the dining room and lowered herself into the shadow of a pillar. From there she could see almost everything inside. The long dining table was already set. Silverware gleamed beneath the chandelier. White bowls released curls of steam. One of the servants placed the final platter at the center and stepped away quickly, as if she wanted no part in whatever mood the evening would bring. A few seconds later, Ayanda entered first. Even at dinner, she moved like someone aware of being watched. Her silk blouse was immaculate, her posture perfect. Her expression carefully burdened, as though she alone carried the invisible weight of maintaining standards in a collapsing world. She sat at the table, adjusted her napkin, glanced toward the empty seat at the head, and something unreadable crossed her face. Not grief, not worry, calculation. Saifo came in next, shoulders tense, phone still in his hand. He looked tired, but not from sorrow. It was the fatigue of a man irritated by inconvenience. He sat to Ayanda's right, without speaking. Then came Themba and Thandeka. Themba walked in with his usual quiet uncertainty, as though every room in the house had already decided where he belonged before he arrived. Thandeka followed with calm restraint, her face composed. Her eyes lowered. No one looking casually would have guessed she had just spent part of the evening feeding and sheltering an old woman from the rain. No one except Lindiwe. That knowledge shifted something inside her. The family took their places, but the seat at the head of the table remained empty, the one Lindiwe always used, the one people instinctively looked toward before speaking too boldly. Tonight that empty chair felt like another guest. A servant poured water. No one touched it. Ayanda broke the silence first. "It is strange," she said softly, with a performance of concern polished to perfection. "Mother has never stayed away this long without updating anyone directly." Saifo cut into his food. "She told the driver she needed time. She tells everyone something different," Ayanda replied. "That is part of the problem." Lindiwe's brows tightened. "Part of the problem?" Themba looked up. "She's still our mother." Ayanda gave him a patient smile, the kind reserved for children and fools. "I did not say she wasn't." Thandeka quietly reached for the bread basket and passed it toward the maid, instead of toward herself first. A tiny act. Barely noticeable. But even now, with tension in the room, her instincts moved toward others before herself. Lindiwe saw it. Ayanda continued dabbing the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "All I am saying is that this family cannot run on mystery forever. We have responsibilities. Staff, company matters, pending approvals." Her eyes slid toward Saifo. Some people should already be preparing for that. Saifo did not answer immediately. He chewed, swallowed, then leaned back in his chair. Preparing for what Ayanda's voice stayed light. Leadership. There it was again. Clean, elegant, dangerous. Themba frowned. "Mother is not dead." Ayanda's expression shifted only a little. but it was enough for Lindiwe to catch the irritation beneath the grace. No one said she was. Ayanda folded her hands. But we would be foolish not to acknowledge reality. She is aging. She is tired. And the business is too large to depend on one woman's instincts forever. The words were not entirely false. That was what made them useful. Lindiwe knew that tactic well. The most effective manipulation rarely used pure lies. It wrapped ambition in practicality, greed, in concern and impatience in the language of responsibility. Sifo stared down at his plate. The board hasn't raised anything yet. Not openly, Ayanda said, but people talk. At that, Lindiwe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wet night. People talk. Yes, they always did. Investors, lawyers, extended family, rivals waiting for weakness. But Ayanda was not repeating rumors. She was feeding them. Thandeka finally spoke gently. This may not be the right time for such a discussion. Ayanda turned toward her slowly. And when would be the right time, Thandeka? The question sounded polite. It was not. Thandeka lowered her gaze, but her voice remained steady. When Mother is present? Ayanda laughed softly without humor. How convenient. Themba shifted in his seat. Enough. No, Ayanda said, still looking at Thandeka. Actually, I am curious. Why is it that every time practical decisions must be discussed, some people suddenly become guardians of sentiment? Thandeka said nothing. That silence changed the atmosphere at once. It irritated Ayanda more than protest would have. Silence gave no direct target, no sentence to slice apart. It simply remained dignified and frustrating. Sifo rubbed his forehead. Ayanda, leave it. But Ayanda was warming to her subject now. We are all adults here. Let us be honest for once. This family acts as though Mother's approval is the sun itself. Everyone bends toward it. Everyone performs around it. Charity dinners, church appearances, smiles in front of guests. Yet behind the scenes, decisions are delayed documents sit unsigned, and no one knows what happens if she suddenly steps back. Lindiwe's eyes narrowed. There it was again. Not fear of instability. Expectation. Ayanda spoke like a woman already rehearsing the world after Lindiwe. A servant entered with a phone on a tray. Sir, she said to Sifo, there is a call from Mr. Maseko. Sifo frowned. At this hour, he said it is urgent. Mr. Maseko, the family lawyer. Lindiwe's heart gave one slow, hard beat. Sifo took the phone and rose from the table, moving a few steps away. The room grew still as everyone pretended not to listen. But even through the glass and rain-muted distance, Lindiwe could sense the change in his posture almost immediately. His spine straightened. His face sharpened. His voice dropped. What do you mean it's incomplete? Ayanda's head snapped toward him. Sifo turned farther away, but not far enough. No, that is not what I was told. Who else knows this? And if something happens before it's finalized? Themba set down his fork. Thandeka looked toward Sifo only once, then lowered her eyes again. Lindiwe felt the weight of the moment settle over the table. A missing signature. An unfinished clause. A future suddenly uncertain enough to make greed nervous. When Sifo returned, he sat slowly. Ayanda waited only 2 seconds before asking, What did he say? Sifo hesitated. Then Mother's final estate instructions have not been fully executed. The effect was instant. Ayanda's fingers tightened around her knife. Themba went still. Even the maid near the doorway seemed to stop breathing. Ayanda recovered first, meaning Sifo's jaw flexed, meaning if anything happens before she finishes the process, there may be delays, disputes, legal review. Ayanda leaned back. For a brief second, one raw, unguarded second, her face revealed naked alarm. Not sorrow, not concern for Lindiwe's safety. Alarm for uncertainty. Then the mask returned. "Well," she said carefully, "all the more reason that someone responsible should begin taking a more active role." Themba looked disgusted. "Can you hear yourself?" Ayanda turned to him sharply. You live in this house. You benefit from this company. But every time reality enters the room, you hide behind emotion." Thandeka lifted her head. "Compassion is not weakness." The sentence fell gently, but it struck like a match dropped on dry grass. Ayanda smiled coldly. "Compassion is lovely in speeches. It is less useful in succession planning." Sifo said nothing. That silence cut Lindiwe deeper than Ayanda's words. Because Ayanda's ambition was visible now, Sifo's was quieter, still hidden beneath the posture of reluctance. But he was not stopping her. He was not offended on his mother's behalf. He was not even pretending anymore. He was listening, measuring, perhaps even agreeing. Lindiwe thought of the front gate, of Ayanda saying old people became sentimental, of the way she had spoken Lindiwe's name instead of mother, of the contempt with which she had viewed the poor woman outside the walls. Then she thought of the back kitchen, the hot soup, the towel, the gentle hands, the caution in Thandeka's eyes. The contrast was no longer subtle. It was moral. The house was dividing itself right in front of her. Ayanda reached for her wine glass, but did not drink. "Tell me honestly," she said to Sifo, her voice low, now intimate and dangerous. "If mother stepped away tomorrow, who here is actually prepared to carry what she built?" Her gaze flicked toward Themba, then toward Thandeka, then back to Sifo. Themba rose halfway from his chair. "This conversation ends now." Sifo did not move. Ayanda's eyes held his. Well, outside the window, hidden in rain and shadow, Lindiwe felt something inside her begin to harden into strategy. The hurt was still there, the betrayal was still forming, but pain in the right hands could become precision. And tonight, precision was what she would need. Because the empty chair at the head of the table was doing exactly what she had hoped it would do. It was pulling the masks off one by one. She looked at Sifo's face, at Ayanda's hunger, at Themba's weakness, at Thandeka's quiet discomfort. Then she understood that the house was not merely tense. It was waiting. Waiting for absence to become opportunity. Waiting for inheritance to become battle. Waiting perhaps for someone to fall before others stopped pretending. Lindiwe stepped back from the window, every instinct in her now sharpened. The dinner table had revealed more than impatience. It had revealed a family already rearranging itself around power. And somewhere inside that rearrangement, she sensed another secret moving one. Not yet fully visible, one hidden behind locked doors, unsigned papers, and lowered voices. If the dining room had exposed ambition, the next truth would be buried deeper. Somewhere no one expected her to look. The house did not sleep after dinner. It only grew quieter in the way dangerous places often did. Less noise, more intention. From the shadows near the west corridor, Lindiwe watched lights go off one by one across the upper floor. A servant closed the drapes in the formal lounge. Someone locked the silver cabinet. The chandeliers dimmed. Footsteps faded into distant bedrooms. Yet beneath that hush, the mansion still breathed with secret movement. A soft door closing where no one should be walking. The faint vibration of a phone against polished wood. The brief glow of a hallway light switched on and off too quickly. Lindiwe had spent years building her empire by understanding one simple truth. When people wanted something badly enough, they always moved at night. Still bent beneath her disguise, she circled back toward the rear veranda and slipped through a side entrance that staff often used. She knew every service corridor in the house. She knew which floorboards creaked, which locks caught, which doors stuck in humid weather. The housekeepers used to laugh that Madame Lindiwe knew the bones of the mansion better than the architect. Tonight, that knowledge belonged to the beggar. The service hallway smelled faintly of soap starch and wood polish. At the far end, a bulb flickered above a narrow staircase leading toward the old study wing. Lindiwe moved slowly at first to preserve the image of age, then faster once she was sure no one watched. Her heartbeat remained steady, but not calm. It was the steady rhythm of a woman entering battle after finally seeing the enemy clearly. The old study wing sat slightly apart from the newer part of the house. That had been her choice years ago. She wanted her workspace separated from family noise, protected from impulse. The room held files, trust documents, company reports, land deeds, private letters, and the unfinished estate papers that now seemed to poison every conversation in her absence. As she approached, she saw it. A thin line of light beneath the study door. Lindiwe stopped. The family had long ago learned not to enter that room casually. Even Saipho, with all his growing entitlement, usually knocked first when she was present. If someone was inside now at this hour without her permission, there were only two possibilities: desperation or conspiracy. She moved closer and pressed herself against the wall beside the half-open door. Inside drawers slid open. Paper rustled. A breath she knew too well controlled impatient expensive. Ayanda. Lindiwe closed her eyes for 1 second, not from surprise, but from the bitter satisfaction of having her suspicion confirmed. Then she listened. Ayanda muttered under her breath as she searched. "Where would you keep it? Not here. Not this." Another sound followed, the tiny click of a phone camera. Lindiwe's gaze sharpened. Ayanda was not just looking. She was recording. The study smelled of leather ink and old cedar shelves. Through the narrow opening, Lindiwe could see her daughter-in-law in the pool of desk lamp light, dressed now in a dark silk robe thrown over her nightclothes. Her hair was tied back. Her face held none of the graceful concern she wore downstairs. It was stripped bare now, focused, irritated, hungry. Open folders lay scattered across the desk. A deed file, a trust summary, board restructuring notes. Ayanda flipped through each with astonishing speed, pausing only to photograph pages that mattered. Then she pulled out her phone and whispered, "I'm in." "No, she keeps everything cross-filed, but I found the asset register." Yes, I'm checking the unsigned estate addendum now." Lindiwe went completely still. There was someone on the other end. Ayanda turned slightly away, but her voice remained audible in the silence of the corridor. "No, listen to me carefully. If the final instructions haven't been filed, then there's a window. A small one, but a window." She listened, then scoffed softly. Of course Saipho is hesitating. That's what he does. He circles power like it's a fire and expects someone else to carry him through the heat. A long pause. Then Ayanda's tone changed. Lower. Sharper, yeah. Which is why I need clarity before the lawyers start tightening everything. Lindiwe felt the words like a blade against bone. So this went beyond private greed, beyond bitter dinner remarks. Ayanda had brought in outside counsel or something worse. Someone advising her. Someone calculating entry points into the family's legal defenses. Ayanda opened another drawer and searched more aggressively now, pushing aside stationary old contracts, a velvet box of antique pens. She found a red folder, froze, and opened it quickly. Her eyes flicked over the contents. Then she smiled. Not warmly. Never warmly. It was the smile of a predator finding a gate unlatched. I found references to the charity holdings, she whispered into the phone. And the transitional voting rights. No, not the final instrument, but enough to understand the structure. Her voice slowed with thought. If the old woman delays too long, there will be confusion about allocation, especially if certain parties appear more stable than others. The old woman. Not mother, not even Lindiwe now. Only a problem to outmaneuver. Something cold settled deeper inside Lindiwe, colder than anger, because it no longer expected better. Ayanda leaned against the desk. And another thing she said. The younger one is still a risk. Lindiwe's attention sharpened instantly. Thandeka. The voice on the phone must have asked something because Ayanda gave a short laugh. Because innocent women are dangerous when sentimental people trust them. She tapped one fingernail against the folder. She plays quiet, helpful, invisible. But those are exactly the women old people mistake for loyal. If Mother returns and starts second-guessing herself, she'll look at Thandeka's soft face and start thinking character matters more than strategy. The insult should have been absurd. Instead, it revealed Ayanda's greatest fear, not exposure, but moral comparison. She feared Thandeka because kindness exposed her. Ayanda listened again, then nodded slowly. Yes, that can be handled. Lindiwe felt the corridor tighten around her. Handled. Ayanda straightened and paced once behind the desk. There are already irregularities in household accounts no one tracks carefully. Petty cash supplier rounding duplicate maintenance receipts. Nothing dramatic, but enough that if someone wanted to create a pattern... She let the sentence trail off. Lindiwe's stomach turned. A setup. Ayanda was planning to build a case against Thandeka, not by proving guilt, by manufacturing suspicion. The voice on the phone spoke again. Ayanda's lips curled. No, she's too stupid to defend herself properly. And Themba is weak. He hates conflict. He folds the moment anyone raises their voice. If pressure lands on them together, they'll break apart on their own. There it was. Her full diagnosis of the household. Saifo's greed. Themba's weakness. Thandeka's silence. Lindiwe's age. Ayanda had not merely entered the family. She had studied it like a battlefield. Lindiwe could hear the blood in her ears now, but she did not move. Every word was evidence. Every word was another nail in the coffin of illusion. Ayanda's voice softened suddenly, almost amused. And if things become complicated, we can always raise concerns about Mother's judgment. She disappears without notice, delays, legal execution, invites strangers and staff into emotional decisions, gives money away like feelings are a retirement plan. She laughed under her breath. It would not be hard to suggest she is no longer thinking as sharply as she once did. Lindiwe's fingers pressed hard into the plaster wall. That was the true strike. Not just inheritance. Removal. They were already shaping the language that could strip her authority without needing her death. Instability, emotionality, age, unsound judgment. The old arsenal used against powerful women the moment others grew impatient for their seat. Ayanda opened another drawer and frowned. This one held something unexpected, a handwritten note clipped to a receipt envelope. She stared at it, then narrowed her eyes. Slowly she pulled out the envelope and emptied its contents onto the desk. Several pharmacy slips. A clinic name. Dates. Amounts. Not from the main family accounts, but linked to small cash withdrawals from the house reserve. Ayanda's expression changed instantly. Interest. Then delight. Oh, she whispered. She lifted one slip closer to the lamp. Lindiwe could not see the name clearly from the doorway, but she saw enough to understand one thing: this was about Thandeka. Ayanda grabbed the phone again, suddenly energized. Wait, I may have just found something even better. She scanned the papers quickly. Medical receipts, repeated visits, quiet cash movement. Not huge, but regular, hidden from the main review process. The voice on the phone must have reacted. Ayanda smiled wider. Exactly. Lindiwe's thoughts raced. So this was why Thandeka had glanced nervously toward her handbag in the kitchen. Why caution lived behind her kindness. She was hiding something financial, or something that could be made to appear financial. Ayanda snapped photos of the slips. Whether it's scandal or just secrecy, it doesn't matter, she murmured. Secrecy is enough. By the time people ask questions, the stain is already there. Lindiwee's breath caught in her throat. That line told her everything about the kind of woman Ayanda truly was. Truth did not matter. Only narrative. Only timing. Only who looked guilty first. A floorboard creaked in the corridor behind Lindiwe. She turned sharply. No one. But the tiny sound made her shift her weight, and the metal tip of her borrowed walking stick brushed the edge of the wall with a faint scrape. Inside the study, Ayanda froze. Silence. Dead and immediate. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Lindiwe flattened herself into shadow. Ayanda ended the call at once. The desk chair scraped backward. Slow footsteps approached the door. For the first time that night, Lindiwee's pulse broke its discipline. If Ayanda opened the door fully and recognized something in her posture, her height, her stillness. If suspicion formed too early, the entire test might collapse before the truth was complete. The doorknob turned. Light widened across the corridor floor. Ayanda stepped halfway out, eyes scanning the darkness. Lindiwe hunched lower, becoming smaller, older, duller beneath her ragged shawl. A shape. A nuisance. A servant's forgotten shadow. Ayanda stared down the hall for several tense seconds. Then her gaze fell to the floor near the wall and narrowed at the faint, wet footprint Lindiwe had left. Not one of the household's shoes. Barely visible. But there. Ayanda stepped farther into the corridor, and in that suspended, breathless moment, Lindiwe understood two things at once. Ayanda had now found material to target Thandeka, and from this moment forward, the game inside the house would become far more dangerous. Because ambition with evidence was bad enough. Ambition with a weapon was worse. Ayanda stood in the corridor for several long seconds listening. The study lamp behind her cast a narrow blade of light across the polished floor. It stopped just short of Lindiwee's shoes. One more step, one more suspicious glance, and the night might have split open too early. But then a burst of laughter drifted up faintly from the servants' wing below. Somewhere else a door shut. Ayanda's attention flickered. She looked once more at the wet mark near the wall, then gave a small sound of irritation. "Useless house," she muttered under her breath. She stepped back inside and closed the study door. Only after the latch clicked into place did Lindiwe breathe. Not deeply, not safely, just enough. She remained pressed against the corridor wall until she heard drawers closing papers, stacked the soft rhythm of Ayanda taking photographs again. Then came footsteps inside the study, slower now. Careful. The kind of movement a person made when she believed she might already be watched. Lindiwe knew she had to leave. More than that, she knew she had to move before Ayanda finished turning those receipts into a weapon. With the patience of a hunter rather than the panic of prey, Lindiwe backed away from the door, retreated down the hall, and descended the narrow staircase into the service corridor again. Her old shawl dragged slightly against the steps. Her borrowed walking stick trembled in her hand, though not from age. Medical receipts, repeated visits, quiet cash movement. That was what Ayanda had found. And whether Thandeka's secret was innocent or dangerous, one fact already stood out with painful clarity. Thandeka had hidden it alone without protection, inside a house full of people who would never give her the benefit of doubt. Lindiwe did not leave the estate this time. Instead, she crossed the backyard, slipped through the side gate the gardeners used, and followed the narrow service lane behind the wall. If Thandeka had been taking money quietly and going somewhere regularly, there would be a pattern. Lindiwe had built her life on patterns. She only had to find the next piece. The lane smelled of wet earth diesel and damp leaves. A few security lights glowed pale in the mist. Beyond the walls of the estate, Johannesburg stretched restless and sleepless, distant traffic music, from some unseen taxi rank, voices rising and fading in the dark. The city had never stopped for anyone's heartbreak. Lindiwe kept moving. Near the rear pedestrian gate, she saw what she had hoped for tire tracks still fresh in the mud. Smaller than the family SUVs, likely from one of the compact cars the staff or younger family members used for private errands. She crouched with difficulty, studying the grooves under the security light. Not much, but enough to confirm recent movement. Then she noticed something else. A folded paper half caught beneath the edge of the drainage grate. She bent, lifted it carefully, and unfolded the damp slip. A parking stub, stamped with the name of a small clinic in the southern outskirts of the city. Her chest tightened. So the receipts were real. The visits were real. Thandeka had not only hidden money, she had been traveling there repeatedly. Lindiwe stood still in the mist, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. This was the point where suspicion could still move in two directions. One path said Thandeka had a secret life, a debt, a lover, a hidden obligation, something that explained her nervous glances and private cash withdrawals. The other path said something far more human, that she had hidden an act of mercy, because mercy in that house could be twisted into weakness. Lindiwe no longer trusted appearances, not gentleness, not silence, not polished speech, not even pain. So she went to the clinic. It took nearly an hour in the cold to reach the main road, and another stretch of stubborn effort to find a taxi willing to stop for an old beggar in wet clothes. The driver looked at her twice in the mirror, clearly suspicious, but money still spoke even through disguise. Lindiwe had hidden small cash inside the hem of her skirt for exactly this reason. By the time she arrived, the clinic looked as tired as the people who depended on it. It was a small building with peeling paint fluorescent lights and a waiting bench under a rusted awning. The rain had nearly stopped. Water dripped from the roof in slow, tired intervals. Inside, through the glass, Lindiwe could see a nurse at a desk and a mother rocking a sleeping child against her chest. Nothing about the place suggested scandal. Everything about it suggested struggle. Lindiwe entered with the shuffling slowness of an old woman keeping her scarf low over her forehead. The nurse glanced up with automatic concern. "Gogo, are you all right?" "I am fine," Lindiwe murmured. "I am looking for someone." The nurse's face changed a little. "Not closed, but careful. Visiting hours are almost over." Lindiwe lowered her voice. "A young woman comes here often. Quiet, respectful. She brings money, food sometimes." She paused, letting uncertainty color her tone. "I think her name is Thandeka." For a second the nurse said nothing. That silence told Lindiwe enough already. Then the nurse softened. "You know her?" Lindiwe nodded faintly. "I know of her." The nurse studied her, perhaps weighing whether this old stranger was safe. Then, because exhaustion often creates its own honesty, she sighed and leaned back. "She has been coming for months?" Lindiwe's heartbeat steadied sharper now. "Why?" The nurse hesitated again, then glanced toward the far room. "Because someone had to." Lindiwe followed her eyes. At the end of the corridor, a child's drawing was taped crookedly to the wall. Beside it stood a plastic chair, a backpack too small for any adult, and a pair of shoes placed neatly underneath, as if someone had taught their owner dignity before comfort. The nurse spoke more quietly. "There is a boy here, 8 years old. His mother worked as a domestic helper before she died. No father in the picture. The child was left in the care of an elderly aunt who has almost nothing." She folded her hands on the desk. "The boy has a heart condition, not the kind rich people fix in one afternoon. The kind poor people survive 1 week at a time. Lindiwe could not speak, not because she did not understand, because she understood too quickly. The nurse continued, unaware that every word was cutting and healing at once. Your young woman pays what she can. Medication, review visits, sometimes school supplies, sometimes transport. She gave a sad smile. Sometimes she just sits with him when he is frightened. Lindiwe felt the air change around her. Not scandal, not betrayal, not theft. Sacrifice. She gripped the edge of the reception desk lightly, as though the room had shifted beneath her feet. "What is the boy's name?" she asked. Cabello. The name landed deep. Lindiwe knew that name. Not the child, but his mother. Years ago, a gentlewoman named Nomusa had worked in the family's old house before Lindiwe expanded the business and moved them into the estate. Nomusa had been one of the quiet, faithful ones, the kind who noticed everyone's needs without announcing her own. She had once stayed all night with Saifo when he had a fever as a child, though it was not her job. She had later left after her own health began failing. Nomusa's son Lindiwe whispered before she could stop herself. The nurse looked surprised. "Yes. You knew her." Lindiwe turned away slightly, pretending to cough. "Knew her. Trusted her. Failed to ask enough about what happened after she left." The nurse's expression softened even more. "Then you know what kind of woman she was. Your Thandeka must have known too. She never says much, but she told us once the boy's mother had served her husband's family long ago." She shook her head faintly. "Most people forget the poor once they stop being useful." She did not. Lindiwe closed her eyes. For one painful second, memories crowded in. Nomusa folding laundry in the sunlight. Nomusa laughing softly at something little Themba had said. Nomusa leaving with tired shoulders and apologizing for needing rest. And now her child sick, fragile, surviving, because a daughter-in-law no one truly saw had chosen to carry a burden that was not hers. "When does Thandeka come?" Lindiwe asked. The nurse glanced at the clock. "Usually on Thursdays, sometimes twice a week if she can. She never stays long when she is in formal clothes, longer when she can come unnoticed." Unnoticed. There was the truth of it again. Thandeka had built her goodness in the shadows because the house she lived in did not reward goodness. It weaponized it. Lindiwe's suspicion dissolved, but not into easy relief. Into shame. Because even she for a few hours tonight had doubted the one person in that house whose heart had remained clean. "Does her husband know?" she asked. The nurse's mouth tightened. "I do not think so. She always comes alone." Of course she did, because Themba was kind enough to avoid cruelty, but not yet strong enough to protect courage. Because in that family, silence had become the price of peace. Because every woman learned quickly which virtues would be mocked and which secrets were safer unshared. The nurse looked toward the corridor again. "Would you like to see the boy?" Lindiwe wanted to say no. She was afraid of what one more truth might do to her tonight. But she nodded. The room was small and dim. Cabello lay sleeping beneath a thin blanket, his chest rising with careful effort. A stuffed lion with one missing eye rested near his pillow. Beside the bed sat a paper bag labeled with medicine instructions, and tucked partly underneath it, a note in neat handwriting. "Be brave. I will come back soon." Lindiwe read it once. Then again. Something inside her broke open. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly the way old grief sometimes returns when it meets unexpected goodness. She had come looking for rot and betrayal. She had found it, yes. But here in this worn little room at the edge of the city, she had also found something much rarer. A woman giving without witness. A woman protecting another life with no promise of reward. A woman carrying the moral weight of a family richer than its conscience. Lindiwe turned away before the nurse could see her eyes fill. She had thought the cruelest revelation tonight would be discovering who wanted her wealth. Instead, this truth hurt in another way, because it proved that while greed had been growing under her roof, quiet goodness had been suffering there too, unseen, unsupported, and dangerously easy to destroy. And now Ayanda had found the receipts, which meant by morning innocence itself might be put on trial. Lindiwe did not return to the estate immediately. She stayed outside the clinic for a long time, standing beneath the rusted awning while the last drops of rain slipped from the roof and dark water gathered in broken concrete cracks near her shoes. In the street beyond, a minibus taxi rumbled past with music too loud for the hour. Somewhere a dog barked, then another answered. The city kept moving, careless and alive, while her world rearranged itself piece by piece. Inside her chest, two truths now pressed against each other with unbearable force. Ayanda was cruel. Thandaka was good. Those truths should have been enough. They were not, because there was still Saipho. And somehow that uncertainty hurt more than anything else. A daughter-in-law could disappoint her. A daughter-in-law could deceive her. But a son, her first son, the boy whose tiny body she had once carried against her heart while learning how to build a business during the day and soothe fevers at night, that wound was deeper. Lindiwe had seen his silence at dinner. She had heard his reluctance. She had felt the shape of his growing hunger. But still some small, exhausted part of her hoped that he was weak rather than wicked. Weakness could be corrected. Wickedness was another thing. By the time she finally made her way back toward the estate, the night had sharpened. The air smelled cleaner after rain. The mansion rose ahead like a lit ship behind high walls, steady and self-important, as though no betrayal could stain marble. Lindiwe slipped in through the service lane again and moved along the outer edge of the garden. A row of floodlights near the garage cast long, pale bands across the stone. One of the upstairs windows was still lit. Saipho's office. He had converted one of the former guest rooms into a private workspace a year earlier, claiming he needed a quiet place for strategic planning. Lindiwe had approved it at the time. She had even admired his desire to involve himself more seriously in the family business. Now she looked at that lit window differently. She circled toward the side terrace beneath it. The sliding door to the small downstairs lounge stood slightly open for air. Through that opening, voices traveled more clearly than they should have. A man's voice. Saipho. Another voice joined it a second later. Male, lower, older, unfamiliar. Lindiwe stopped in the shadow of a potted palm. The stranger was not in the house. His voice came faint and flattened through a speakerphone. Saipho was pacing. She could tell by the rhythm of his footsteps across the wooden floor. I said I'm handling it, Saipho muttered. The voice on the call answered too softly to catch every word, but Lindiwe heard enough. Delay. Not secure. Your mother. Saipho exhaled sharply. My mother never lets go of anything willingly. You know that. Lindiwe went still. No pain yet, only attention. The stranger spoke again. A longer stretch this time. Something about exposure. About timing. About financial review. Saipho answered with irritation that sounded far too practiced to be new. That money was not stolen. It was repositioned. Lindiwe felt her blood turn cold. Repositioned. The favorite word of men who moved what was not theirs and wanted language to wash it clean. Saipho continued pacing. Temporary transfers happen all the time. Once the expansion settles, I can return the amount before anyone needs a forensic review. The voice on the phone must have challenged him because Saipho snapped back lower now, but more dangerous. No, listen to me. If the board had let me move earlier on the Lusaka project, none of this would have been necessary. I needed liquidity. The opportunity window was closing. He paused, then added, "And before you say it, yes, I know the funds touched a restricted internal reserve." Lindywee's hand tightened around her walking stick. A restricted reserve. Not carelessness. Not a bookkeeping error. He knew exactly what he had done. The stranger said something about documentation. Sifo gave a humorless laugh. Documentation can be adjusted. What matters is control. There it was, no wife's influence, no confusion, no pressure, control. Every mother reaches a point, if she lives long enough, when she discovers whether the child she raised became a man or only a larger version of his appetites. Lindywee stood in the dark and felt that discovery entering her like a blade that knew the exact soft place to strike. Sifo stopped pacing, his voice lowered, intimate with ambition. If my mother finalizes the estate the way she has been threatening power fractures, charity gets more than it should. There are protective structures for people who never built anything. Emotional allocations. Legacy nonsense. He scoffed. If I am going to carry this family into the next decade, I need central authority. Not symbolic influence. Legacy nonsense. Lindywee shut her eyes. She had spent years teaching her sons that wealth without conscience turned men into polished animals. She had said it at birthday dinners, during board visits, in quiet car rides home from church. Sifo had nodded through all of it. He had learned the language of values well enough to repeat it in public. But repetition was not belief. And now in the dark, the belief underneath had finally spoken. The stranger's voice sharpened slightly through the speaker. This part came clearer. And if she refuses, Sifo answered without hesitation, then we make it difficult for her to keep operating the old way. Lindywee opened her eyes slowly. The room beyond the terrace glass blurred for a moment, not because she did not understand, but because she understood too much. The call continued. I'm not talking about hurting her, Sifo said impatiently, as though morality still mattered in tiny, convenient pieces. I'm talking about reality. She's aging. She disappears without notice. She delays decisions. She allows staff and sentiment to interfere with business. It would not take much for certain people to start questioning whether she still has the objectivity to lead. Lindywee nearly laughed then, though no sound left her mouth. The same argument, the same poison. Ayanda had not invented it. She had been echoing him. That realization landed harder than any insult. For days, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, this narrative had already been forming in the shadows of her own house. Not just greed waiting for opportunity, but strategy, preparing language. Not just impatience, but a plan to frame her strength as instability, her generosity as incompetence, her age as unfitness. And Sifo was not reluctantly dragged along. He was authoring it. The stranger must have asked about other family members because Sifo's tone shifted into analysis. Themba is irrelevant unless pushed. He hates confrontation. If things become public, he'll fold under pressure before he chooses a side. Lindywee's jaw tightened. Then came the next line. And Thandeka? The voice asked faintly. Sifo gave a sharp little breath through his nose. She is a softer problem. Too quiet to lead, too decent to fight properly, but dangerous if my mother starts idealizing her. Women like that get mistaken for moral anchors when they're really just passive. Passive. Lindywee thought of the soup in the back kitchen, the towel, the clinic room, Cabello's sleeping face, the note signed only with a T. Passive, no. What Sifo feared was not passivity. It was incorruptibility. He went on, careless now in his certainty. Ayanda thinks she found something useful tonight. Cash movement linked to Thandeka, medical receipts, quiet visits. If it can be framed properly, it gives us leverage. At minimum, it raises doubt. Lindiwe's heart gave one brutal beat. So Ayanda had already communicated her discovery. Fast, efficient, hungry. The stranger asked another question. Saipho answered almost lazily. No, I don't care if the girl actually did anything wrong. That's not the point. In families, suspicion does half the work for you. That sentence broke something. Not in the dramatic way stories often describe heartbreak. No collapsing, no cry tearing from the throat. Just a deep internal fracture, clean and irreversible. As though the final beam holding up an old roof had quietly split in the night. Because there it was, the full truth. Not greed alone, not ambition alone, not even betrayal alone. A willingness to sacrifice the innocent for convenience. Sifo Hassan was willing to stain Thandeka's name, weaken Themba's marriage, and destabilize the moral center of the family, so long as it brought him closer to the chair at the head of the table. Lindiwe had come into this test expecting one villain, perhaps two. Instead, she had found the deepest rot in the branch she herself had watered first. Inside the room, Saipho poured himself a drink. Ice clinked against crystal. I'm done waiting, he said. I've lived too long in the shadow of a woman who refuses to die, retire, or trust anyone fully. Lindiwe stopped breathing. The line hung in the air long after he said it. Sometimes cruelty arrives dressed in temper. Sometimes in polished language. And sometimes it arrives as a child speaking about his mother, as if she were a locked door he had grown tired of knocking on. The stranger said something too low to hear. Saipho drank, then replied in a flat voice that no longer even pretended affection. If she returns and stays firm, we escalate. There was movement upstairs, then a door opening, footsteps crossing the landing. Sifo glanced toward the sound and lowered his voice. I'll call tomorrow. But understand this, if control slips now, I may never get another chance. The call ended. Saipho stood alone for several seconds, staring into the reflection in the gantrang, in the glass door. In the terrace shadow beyond that reflection stood Lindiwe, unseen, bent and ragged and shattered. He looked tired, not guilty, not conflicted, not wounded by what he had become, only tired of delay. That was what finally stripped away the last mercy in her judgment. He had not stumbled. He had chosen. Lindiwe stepped back from the opening before he could approach it. Her legs felt heavier now, not from age, but from grief. Yet beneath the grief something steadier began to form. Clarity. Not the hot clarity of revenge. The colder kind. The kind that lets a woman stop begging her illusions to live. By the time she crossed the garden again, dawn was still hours away, but she no longer felt lost in the night. Pain had given shape to purpose. Ayanda was ambitious. Yes, but Saipho was the greater betrayal, because Ayanda had entered the family wanting power. Saipho had been born inside love, and still learned to despise its limits. As Lindiwe disappeared into the darkest line of hedges near the back wing, one truth settled fully inside her. She was no longer testing her daughters-in-law. She was preparing to judge her sons, and before this house saw daylight again, she knew exactly whose face would haunt her most. The night thinned toward dawn, but the house did not soften with it. After what she had heard outside Saipho's office, Lindiwe no longer moved through the estate like a woman searching for answers. She moved like a woman carrying them. Every hallway, every locked door, every polite silence now belonged to a different map. Not family, not home. A field of loyalties, a field of weakness, a field of hunger. Yet for all the clarity that had settled inside her grief, still dragged at her body like wet cloth. She made her way back toward the rear side of the estate, and sat for a while beneath the small overhang near the laundry room, letting the cold seep through her borrowed layers. Her knees ached. Her back burned. Her hands trembled from exhaustion. She had spent years telling herself she was strong enough to face any market crash, any betrayal in business, any public humiliation. But this was not business. This was blood, and blood knew exactly where to cut. Somewhere inside the house a clock struck 1, then another half-hour passed. Lights dimmed further. A dog barked twice in the neighboring yard and fell silent. The city beyond the walls quieted into that strange hour when only the sleepless, the guilty, and the poor remained fully awake. Lindiwe closed her eyes for only a moment. When she opened them again, the sky had darkened once more with a second wave of rain clouds. Wind stirred the trees. A faint shiver moved through her body. She needed one more truth. Not because she doubted Thandeka anymore, but because truth did not become complete until it was tested under pressure. That was when she heard voices again. Closer this time. At the back entrance. She rose slowly and moved toward the narrow path that led to the service door. Through the rain-damp darkness, she saw Ayanda standing beneath the awning arms folded tightly across her chest. Phone in hand, Saipho stood beside her, already dressed in fresh clothes, restless, annoyed. "You're overreacting," Saipho said. Ayanda gave a short laugh. "No, I am reacting appropriately to a house that keeps secrets under its own roof." Saipho rubbed his jaw. "Then wait until morning, and give Thandeka time to hide whatever she's hiding." Lindiwe stilled in the shadow of a pillar. So it had begun. Ayanda's voice sharpened. "You heard what I found. I heard what you suspect. I suspect enough." She stepped closer to him. "Repeated clinic visits, hidden cash movement, quiet payments. She's either burying debt supporting someone she shouldn't be, or moving money outside the house without permission." Saipho's tone turned colder. "Then use it carefully." Ayanda stared at him. "That is exactly what I'm doing. But if your mother comes back before we control the story..." "She's not back." Saipho cut in. "Not yet." The words hung in the damp air. Saipho looked toward the garden, irritated by the weather, the hour, the tension, everything except his own conscience. "What do you want to do?" Ayanda lowered her voice. "Pressure her. Now, yes, now. Quietly. If she panics, she'll reveal more." Saipho hesitated. Not because it was wrong, because it was messy. Lindiwe knew that expression on her son's face. It was the look of a man weighing risk, not morality. Finally he said, "No public scene." Ayanda's smile was small and satisfied. "Of course not." They disappeared inside through the service door. Lindiwe's heart sank, then steadied. So this was the moment. She had already seen Thandeka's kindness in private. Now she would see what that kindness looked like when cornered. Rain began again, light at first, then steadier. Lindiwe moved across the back path and deliberately let her foot catch on the edge of the stone step near the kitchen entrance. She fell hard enough to make the pain real. A cry escaped her throat, not entirely acted. The sound vanished into the rain for a second, then the service door opened. Not Ayanda, not Saipho. Thandeka. She had thrown a shawl over her nightclothes and rushed out without even putting on proper shoes. Her face was pale with alarm. "Oh, Mama," she whispered to the disguised old woman. "You again." There was no frustration in her voice, only worry. Lindiwe let herself remain slumped on the wet stone. "I am sorry. I tried to leave. My legs..." Thandeka knelt instantly, heedless of the rain soaking her skirt. "Don't move too quickly. Did you hit your head?" Before Lindiwe could answer, Ayanda appeared in the doorway behind her. Saipho stood farther back, one hand in his pocket, impatience already hardening his features. For a split second, Ayanda said nothing. Then she looked at Thandeka kneeling in the rain, and something venomous flashed across her face. "You brought her back." Thandeka did not rise. She fell. Ayanda stepped outside just far enough to avoid the worst of the rain. That is not my question. She came back on her own. Or perhaps Ayanda said softly, she knew someone in this house would make poor decisions. Thandaka finally looked up. Lindiwe felt the shift at once. Not anger, weariness. A woman who had endured this kind of cruelty before and already knew that defending herself would cost more than silence. Sifo spoke from the doorway. "Get the guard!" "No," Thandaka said quickly. "She's cold. Let me at least bring her inside for a few minutes." Ayanda let out a disbelieving breath. "Inside again. She is sick. She is manipulative," Ayanda snapped. "Street people watch houses like this. They learn who is weak." Lindiwe watched Sifo carefully. He did not rebuke his wife. He did not tell her she had gone too far. He simply looked at Thandaka and said, "You need to stop inviting problems into the house." Inviting problems? Lindiwe felt those words settle like ash. Thandeka rose slowly to her feet, rain running down the side of her face. "She is a human being." Ayanda crossed her arms. "And you are proving my point. What point? That you hide things behind compassion." The sentence hit its target. Thandeka went very still. Sifo noticed it too. Lindiwe saw the moment suspicion became pressure. Ayanda stepped closer, voice low and dangerous. "Should we discuss where your secret money has been going? Since we are all being generous tonight." For the first time, real alarm broke through Thandeka's calm. Not guilt. Protection. She glanced instinctively toward Sifo, then toward the hall beyond him, as if checking how far this conversation might spread. Ayanda smiled when she saw that glance. "Ah, so there is something." Thandeka's voice fell to almost a whisper. "This is not the time." "Then there is definitely something," Ayanda said. Sifo's gaze sharpened. What money? Thandeka looked trapped now, not because her secret was shameful, but because it was precious. Lindiwe knew that look. It was the look of someone cornered over the one thing she could not bear to have desecrated. Ayanda saw it too, and pressed harder. Small cash withdrawals, repeated clinic visits, hidden receipts. Her tone dripped with false sympathy. "Would you like to explain, or should we assume the worst?" The rain intensified, drumming on the awning. Lindiwe remained on the ground, every muscle in her body tight with contained fury. This was what cruelty looked like when it found a clean heart. It called that heart suspicious for bleeding where others did not. Thandeka lifted her chin, but her voice shook. "It has nothing to do with the company." "That is not an answer," Sifo said. "It is enough of one." Ayanda laughed softly. "No, it isn't." Then came the smallest but most important shift of the night. Themba appeared. He had clearly just woken. His shirt was half-buttoned, his hair uncombed. His face lined with confusion that sharpened into alarm when he saw the scene. The old beggar on the wet stones. Thandeka standing in the rain. Ayanda circling like a knife, Sifo watching like a judge. "What is happening?" he asked. Ayanda answered first. "Ask your wife." Themba frowned. What Sifo pointed toward Thandeka. "She's been hiding money and visiting some clinic." Quietly. Thandeka closed her eyes for a second. Lindiwe felt her own heart pound harder. This was the moment where weak men usually failed. Themba looked from Sifo to Thandeka. "Is that true?" Thandeka said nothing, not because she had no answer, because she knew what kind of room this had become. Ayanda spread her hands. "See!" Themba's jaw tightened. "Thandeka." Still silence. Rain streamed from the edge of the roof between them like a curtain. Then he looked down, at Lindiwe, at the soaked old woman no one but his wife had cared enough to touch. He saw the mud on Thandeka's knees, the wet shawl clinging to her shoulders, the way she stood between the stranger and the others, without even seeming to realize she had taken that position. Something in his face changed. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. She was helping someone, he said quietly. Ayanda blinked. "Excuse me," Themba lifted his eyes to hers. "That's what she does." Ayanda scoffed. "You don't know that." "No," he said a little stronger now. "I haven't known enough." "That is true." Thandeka looked at him, stunned. Sifo's expression darkened. "Don't be naive." Themba turned toward his brother. "And don't be cruel." The sentence landed harder than shouting would have. For a second, no one moved. Themba stepped out into the rain and crouched beside Lindiwe. "Can you stand?" Mama Lindiwe almost could not answer, because until this moment Themba had always seemed too soft, too hesitant, too eager to avoid conflict. But now, kneeling in the rain beside the woman everyone else wanted removed, he looked less weak than unfinished. "I can try," she whispered. He helped her carefully. Thandeka moved at once to take Lindiwe's other arm. Their hands met across the disguised woman's back. Husband and wife, for the first time that night, standing on the same side of a moral line. Ayanda stared at them in open disgust. "So this is what we're doing, sheltering strangers and defending secrets in the middle of the night." Themba rose with Lindiwe supported between them. Rain ran down his face. He looked at Ayanda, then Sifo. "No," he said. "This is what you're doing." A silence followed so sharp it almost felt holy. Sifo's mouth hardened. "Careful, Themba." Themba did not flinch. "No, you be careful." Lindiwe felt it then. The turning, not a triumph. Not yet. But the first honest fracture in the old balance of fear. Thandeka led her toward the small room near the back corridor. Themba opened the door for them. Behind them, Ayanda said something bitter under her breath, but neither of them stopped. Inside the room was simple: a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a side lamp, a folded blanket at the foot. Thandeka moved quickly to find dry cloths. Themba stood by the door, breathing hard, as if surprised by his own courage. Lindiwe sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both. At the woman whose goodness had survived secrecy. At the man who at last had begun to see. The rain fell harder outside, and for the first time since the test had begun, Lindiwe felt tears sting behind her eyes. Not because the house had become less cruel, but because in all that cruelty, one hand had still reached out. And now, perhaps another had begun to follow. Morning arrived without mercy. The rain had stopped before dawn, but the house still carried the wet hush of a storm that had not truly passed. Sunlight slid across the estate in pale bands touching polished railings, stone steps, trimmed hedges, and the grand windows of a mansion that now felt less like a home than a courtroom awaiting its first witness. Lindiwe had not slept. In the small room at the back of the house, she had sat in silence through the last hours of darkness, while Thandeka brought her dry clothes, hot tea, and a blanket. Themba had remained nearby longer than expected, saying little, pacing once, sitting down, rising again, as though something inside him was finally waking and did not yet know how to stand. Neither of them had recognized her. That more than anything told Lindiwe how complete the disguise had become, not only on her face, but in the family's blindness. Wealth had made them inattentive. Pride had made them careless. Cruelty had made them certain that the poor did not matter enough to be seen. At 6:30, before the rest of the house had fully come alive, Lindiwe used the old service phone in the laundry office and made 3 calls. The first was to Mr. Maseko, the family lawyer. The second was to the head of her internal audit team. The third was to the chairman of the company board. She did not explain everything. She did not need to. Her voice alone was enough to turn confusion into immediate obedience. By 9 o'clock, a family and executive meeting had been called in the main conference room attached to the house's private office wing. The message sent to everyone was brief, and cold attendance required no delays, all key documents to be brought. Then Lindiwe waited. From the back corridor, still in disguise, she watched the household shift into nervous motion. Servants carried trays, lowered their eyes, and whispered in fragments. Phones rang more often than usual. Footsteps moved faster. Doors opened and shut with controlled force. Fear had entered the walls, and fear always changed the tempo of a house. Ayanda was the first to appear fully dressed. She moved down the hall in a deep green suit, elegant and severe, her hair sleek, her expression composed with effort. But Lindiwe saw it now, the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the tension around her mouth, the restless calculation in her eyes. Ayanda had expected to control the next chapter. She had not expected the chapter itself to summon her. Sifo came next, carrying a leather folder and wearing the face of a man who had talked himself into confidence because panic would be too revealing. He glanced at his phone repeatedly. Once he muttered under his breath, this could still be procedural, but his fingers were too tight around the folder. Themba entered later, quieter than the others, but not as bowed as before. He had a different posture this morning. Not dramatic, not transformed into a hero overnight, but less apologetic, less dissolving. He walked beside Thandaka rather than ahead of her or behind her. When Ayanda's eyes flicked toward Thandaka with thinly veiled contempt, Themba noticed and did not look away. That too mattered. Thandaka wore a simple navy dress with her hair pulled back. Her face was calm, but not untouched. Lindiwe could see the fatigue in her eyes, the strain of a woman who knew suspicion had already been cast over her and had no idea how far it might spread. Yet she carried herself with dignity. Not brittle, not defensive, just tired and quiet and unashamed in the way only the innocent can be when they have been wounded deeply enough. At 9 sharp, the board chairman arrived with 2 senior company officials. Mr. Maseko followed carrying a locked document case. Behind him came a woman from the Internal Audit Office and a younger legal assistant. Their presence sent a visible ripple through the room. This was no longer family irritation. It had become consequence. The conference room was large, formal, and intimidating by design. One wall was glass looking out over the garden. Another held framed photographs of company expansions awards and ribbon cuttings. At the far end stood a polished table large enough to seat 12 with Lindiwe's chair at the head. And at first that chair stood empty. Everyone noticed. Sifo took his seat with measured composure. Ayanda sat beside him, perfectly arranged, but too still. Themba and Thandaka sat across from them. No one touched the water poured at each place. Mr. Maseko cleared his throat. "We will begin shortly." Ayanda gave him a careful smile. "Has Mother been located?" The lawyer looked at her. She is aware of the meeting. It was not an answer. Ayanda knew it. So did everyone else. A heavy silence settled over the room. Papers remained closed. Phones lay face down. Outside, a bird landed on the edge of the fountain and flew off again. Then the side door opened. The old beggar entered first. Her shawl was clean now, but still plain. Her steps were slow. Her head bowed. For one stunned second, no one understood what they were seeing. Ayanda's face hardened instantly. "What is this?" Sifo half rose from his chair. "Why is she in here?" Thandeka went pale. Themba turned sharply toward the door. The beggar walked forward, not quickly, not theatrically, just steadily enough to force the room to wait. Mr. Maseko stood. So did the chairman. That was the first crack. Ayanda saw it and frowned. Then the old woman reached the head of the table, her hands lifted to the edges of the scarf. Slowly, deliberately, she untied it. The room changed before the cloth even fell. Something in the posture, the spine, The stillness. Sipho's face lost all color. Ayanda's breath caught. Thandeka's hand flew to her mouth. Themba went rigid. Lindiwe removed the wig next. Then the false age darkening around her jaw. Then the cracked spectacles. One piece at a time she peeled away poverty until only truth remained. When she lifted her head fully, she was no longer the beggar at the gate. She was Lindiwe, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt like the house itself had stopped breathing. Ayanda stood abruptly. "Mother, no," Lindiwe said. One word, low, calm, devastating. Ayanda sat back down. Lindiwe remained standing at the head of the table, her eyes moving from face to face. Not wildly, not with theatrical rage, with the terrible composure of a woman who no longer needed to guess. "I wanted truth," she said. "So I removed comfort from the room and watched what remained." No one spoke. Lindiwe looked first at Ayanda. "At my gate when I asked for water, you looked at me as if I were filth. You ordered the guard to remove me before the neighbors could see." Her voice never rose. "Later you told staff that kindness is a weakness when one is rich. You spoke of my age as if it were an administrative inconvenience. You searched my study. You photographed documents. You discussed legal windows and control?" Ayanda's mouth parted. "I can explain. You will not interrupt me again." The sentence landed like a blade on marble. Lindiwe turned to Mr. Maseko. He opened the document case and laid out printed screenshots, time-stamped access logs, and copies of pages removed from desk order during the night. The internal audit officer placed a second file beside them. Ayanda stared at the papers, her composure cracking. Lindiwe's gaze shifted to Sipho. "My son." She let the title hang for a moment before continuing. "You stood in your office and spoke of restricted reserves as though theft could be washed clean by calling it repositioning. You discussed control, not stewardship. You described my legacy work as nonsense. You said you had lived too long in the shadow of a woman who refused to die. Retire or trust anyone fully." Sipho stood. "That is not what I meant." Lindiwe's eyes did not move. "Those were your words." He looked toward the others as if public context might save him. "The company needs structure. I was talking about succession, not betrayal." The audit officer opened her file. "Preliminary review confirms unauthorized movement from a restricted internal reserve linked to the Lusaka expansion channel," she said. "The transfers were concealed through temporary routing entries." Sipho's jaw tightened. "Temporary. Reversible." "Unauthorized," the chairman corrected. Across the table, Themba looked at his brother as though seeing him clearly for the first time. Lindiwe turned then to the sharpest wound in the room. "Last night you both discussed creating suspicion around Thandeka." Ayanda reacted first. "Because she was hiding something." "Yes," Lindiwe said. "Mercy." That one word shattered the room in a different way. Thandeka looked up stunned. Lindiwe faced everyone now, especially Sipho and Ayanda. "You found medical receipts and thought you had found scandal. You saw secret clinic visits and assumed corruption. You prepared to stain an innocent woman because secrecy was useful to your ambition." Ayanda tried again. "Mother, we did not know." "You did not ask." Silence. Lindiwe continued, and for the first time, emotion entered her voice. Not weakness, but grief, sharpened into truth. "Thandeka has been paying for treatment for Kabelo, the son of Nomusa, a woman who served this family faithfully before some of you learned how to pronounce the word loyalty. The child is ill. His mother is dead. And while you hunted weakness in this house, she carried responsibility that did not belong to her and carried it alone." Thandeka's eyes filled instantly. Themba turned toward her stricken. Sipho looked away first. Ayanda did not. She sat very still, but something ugly and cornered moved beneath her expression. Lindiwe saw it and finished what she had come to do. As of this morning, she said, Saipho and Ayanda are suspended from all discretionary authority in the company pending legal and financial review. Access to internal decision channels is frozen. Mr. Maseko will begin formal protective actions regarding the estate. The board will receive full records. Sifo slammed a palm against the table. You're humiliating me over a misunderstanding. Lindewi looked at him with a sorrow more punishing than anger. No, I am judging you for a revelation. He stared at her, then at the table, then at the files. For the first time he had no language left to hide behind. Ayanda rose more carefully, trying another strategy. This is emotional. You disappeared. You disguised yourself. You created instability and you revealed character, Lindewi said. Ayanda stopped. The chairman folded his hands. Mrs. Dlamini is correct. The use of Lindewi's formal family title in that moment made everything final. Across the room, Themba finally spoke. Not loudly, not with borrowed courage, with his own. You were going to blame my wife for your greed. Sifo turned to him sharply. Don't be dramatic. Themba stood. No, I have been silent too long. That ends now. Thandeka looked at him with shock and pain, and something else beginning underneath something fragile as first light. Lindewi saw it, and despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the shame, despite the family breaking open in front of her own eyes, tears rose suddenly and burned behind hers. Not because she had lost the illusion, because she had found the truth, and the truth at last was forcing every mask in the room to fall. No one left the conference room when the first wave of shock passed. That was the strange thing about truth when it finally entered a family built on performance. It did not explode and disappear. It stayed. It sat in every chair. It clung to the glass walls. It moved through the silence like a living thing, asking each person in the room who they would be now that pretending had become impossible. Lindewi remained standing at the head of the table for several seconds after her final words. Her hands were steady, but only because she had spent the entire night training her grief to stand upright. Inside, she felt raw, exposed. Not because her disguise had fallen away, but because motherhood itself had been stripped down to its most painful truth. Love could build a home, feed a family sacrifice for years, and still fail to prevent greed from growing under the same roof. Mr. Maseko closed one file and opened another. In light of what has been established, he said carefully, protective provisions will be enacted immediately. Temporary control structures are already drafted. No asset redistribution can proceed without direct written authorization from Madame Lindewi. Saipho gave a bitter laugh, but it broke halfway through. So that's it, he asked. One night of theatrics and suddenly I'm treated like a criminal. The internal audit officer answered before Lindewi did. You are being treated like a person under financial review, she said evenly. What comes after that depends on facts. Sifo looked at his mother again. Anger still burned in his face, but now something else had entered it too. Fear, yes, but also the first thin crack of shame. He had not expected exposure. He had expected negotiation. Perhaps even emotional blackmail. But Lindewi had brought in witnesses' documentation structure. She had responded not like an offended parent, but like the woman who had built an empire by knowing when compassion must stop protecting corruption. Ayanda rose more slowly this time. Even in disgrace, she'd tried to carry elegance like armor. Mother, you are making decisions in a moment of hurt, she said. Surely you can see that this needs calm discussion. Lindewi turned to her, and the room seemed to shrink. Do not call manipulation calm discussion. Ayanda's jaw tightened. Lindewi stepped away from the head chair at last and walked around the table, not quickly, not threateningly, but with enough purpose to force every eye to follow her. She stopped beside Thandeka first. Up close she could see the younger woman's composure beginning to fray. Thandeka's hands were clasped too tightly. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She looked less relieved than overwhelmed, like someone who had survived the fire, but not yet understood that the burning had stopped. Lindiwe's voice softened, though it did not lose strength. You should never have had to hide goodness in your own home. At that, Thandeka broke. Not dramatically, not with sobs. Just one sharp, helpless inhale, and then tears rolled down before she could stop them. She lowered her face at once, embarrassed by emotion, in a room that had just watched cruelty stripped bare. I didn't want anyone to use him, she whispered, or laugh at him, or turn him into one more argument. Lindiwe felt those words enter her like a prayer and a wound at the same time. Kabelo, Namusa's son. A sick child had been safer in secrecy than in a wealthy family's open knowledge. That truth alone condemned the house more than any audit ever could. You protected what was fragile, Lindiwe said. That is not shameful. That is sacred. Across the table Themba's head bowed. The sentence seemed to strike him too, but from another angle. Lindiwe looked at him next and saw clearly what she had only begun to suspect the previous night. He was not a bad man. He was a weak one who had finally become sick of his own weakness. That mattered. Weakness could still choose, and now he had. Themba, she said. He lifted his eyes. You failed your wife for too long. He swallowed. I know. No excuses, no rushed defense. That honesty, small as it was, changed the air. Lindiwe nodded once. But last night you stood where it cost you something. Remember that feeling. A man becomes worthy not when courage is easy, but when he chooses it late and keeps choosing it anyway. Themba's throat worked. He glanced at Thandeka, and for the first time in a long while there was no distance in that look. Only regret. And the beginning of resolve. I will, he said quietly. Then came the hardest part. Lindiwe turned back toward Sifo. A mother can discipline a child, a leader can remove an executive, a businesswoman can confront theft. But to stand before the son you once fed from your own body and say you have become dangerous to this family, that was a cruelty grief inflicted on the truthful, not the weak. Sifo met her stare, though less steadily now. You've always loved control, he said, grasping for something to stand on. That's the real issue here. You never trusted anyone enough to let go. Lindiwe looked at him for a long moment. Then she answered in a voice so calm that it cut deeper than anger ever could. No, Sifo. I did not let go because I kept waiting for wisdom to grow where entitlement was growing instead. His face flinched. Not much, but enough. You confuse inheritance with reward. Lindiwe continued. You speak as though blood alone should deliver power into your hands. But inheritance is not permission. It is responsibility. And responsibility without character becomes violence. No one moved. Even Ayanda remained silent now. Lindiwe went on. Do you know what broke my heart most? Not that you wanted control. Not even that you moved money you had no right to touch. It was this, that you were willing to stain an innocent woman to make your path cleaner. Sifo's eyes fell to the table. For the first time he did not interrupt. Because there was nothing to argue with. Truth becomes unbearable when it names the one thing a person cannot defend without condemning himself further. Lindiwe exhaled slowly. The anger in her had burned into something heavier, sadder, clearer. You will face the consequences of what you have done, she said. Not because I hate you, because I refuse to help you become worse. That sentence landed in the room with finality. Sifo's lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. Ayanda tried once more. And what about me? You make me sound like I poisoned everything but this family was already divided, already weak. I only refused to be blind to reality. Lindiwe turned to her. No. You studied weakness and called it wisdom. You saw wounds and called them leverage. You saw kindness and called it stupidity. That is not realism, Ayanda. That is moral poverty dressed in expensive language. Ayanda went pale. There was no accusation she could reverse there, no loophole, no polished phrase strong enough to survive a judgment so cleanly spoken. Mr. Maseko cleared his throat gently, sensing that the business portion had reached its human limit. Madam, he said to Lindiwe, shall I proceed with the legal directives? Lindiwe nodded. Yes. He distributed preliminary notices. A temporary suspension of discretionary authority for Sifo and Ayanda. Formal review of the restricted reserve movement. Protective freezing of succession-related changes pending direct restatement by Lindiwe. Creation of an interim oversight structure. The papers made soft sounds as they were set down, but to the family they might as well have been stones. Then Lindiwe did something none of them expected. She moved back to the head of the table, but instead of sitting she placed one hand on the chair and said, I will also make one immediate family decision. Everyone looked up. She turned toward Thandeka. As of today, the Lindiwe Foundation will be expanded into a permanent family trust for medical and educational support. It will begin with Kabelo's full treatment covered. After that, it will continue for children of former staff and vulnerable families linked to our communities. She paused. And I want Thandeka to oversee its founding work with a professional team around her. The room changed again, this time not with shock, but with something closer to moral gravity settling into place. Thandeka stared at her. Mother, I don't know if I can— Yes, you can, Lindiwe said. Not because you are loud, not because you seek power, because when no one was watching you still chose responsibility. Tears spilled down Thandeka's face openly now. Themba covered his mouth, briefly overcome, in a way he clearly had not expected. Even the board chairman's expression softened. Lindiwe let the silence hold for one more beat, then added, and Themba will support that work, not as a shadow, but as a husband who has finally decided what kind of man he wishes to be. Themba nodded immediately. I will. This time there was no hesitation in it. Sifo looked up sharply at that pain and resentment mixing in his expression. For the first time in years, the future he had assumed belonged to him was moving somewhere he could neither command nor charm back into place. Lindiwe saw that pain. She did not enjoy it. That was the hardest part of justice within a family. If done rightly, it satisfied conscience, but never cruelty. There was no triumph in watching your child face himself, only necessity. She looked at Sifo one last time. I am not erasing you, she said, but you will not lead anything until you learn the difference between ambition and stewardship. If that lesson comes, there may still be a road back. Not to entitlement, to dignity. A tear finally slipped down Sifo's face. He wiped it away almost angrily, humiliated by his own humanity arriving too late. Lindiwe's own eyes filled then, not because she had won, because she had lost illusions and found beneath them something both uglier and more beautiful than she expected. Yes, betrayal had lived in her house. Yes, greed had worn the face of her own son. But mercy had lived there too, quietly, faithfully, without applause. And that mercy had survived. She looked around the room at Ayanda's silence, Sifo's broken pride, Themba's awakening, Thandeka's tear-streaked strength, the files, the witnesses, the fallen masks. Then she finally sat in the head chair. Not as a queen reclaiming a throne, as a mother choosing what kind of inheritance would survive her. When she spoke again, her voice trembled just enough to reveal the heart inside the steel. "Money can build walls," she said. "It can buy comfort, obedience, even appearances. But it cannot make a family honest. It cannot make a coward brave. It cannot make a greedy heart clean. Only character can do that. And from today forward, that is the only inheritance in this house that will truly matter." No one answered. No one needed to, because the judgment had already been spoken. And in the aching silence that followed, Lindiwe felt tears finally slide down her face, not because she had discovered how much falsehood had surrounded her, but because in the middle of all that falsehood, she had still found one heart that chose love over advantage. That discovery did not erase the pain, but it made healing possible. Some people inherit money, some inherit land power or a famous family name. But the most valuable inheritance in life is character. This story reminds us that the truth about a person is rarely revealed when life is easy. It is revealed in quiet moments when there is nothing to gain, no applause to receive, and no powerful eyes watching. Greed may wear beautiful clothes. Pride may speak with polished words. But kindness, honesty, and compassion always leave a different kind of mark, one that cannot be bought and cannot be faked forever. Lindiwe's pain was not only the pain of betrayal, it was the heartbreak of realizing that love, sacrifice, and provision do not automatically build gratitude inside another person's heart. And yet even in that heartbreak, she discovered something deeply healing. Goodness still exists. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is hidden. Sometimes it survives in the one person nobody notices. But it is there. And in the end, that goodness shines brighter than wealth, louder than lies, and stronger than manipulation. The real lesson is simple but powerful. Never measure people by status, beauty, or performance. Measure them by how they treat the weak, the forgotten, and the helpless. Because in those moments, heaven sees clearly, and so does life. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments, who do you think showed the greatest strength in this family and why? And if you love powerful stories about truth, justice, and healing, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more.